And now I would like to invite our wonderful chalice lighter, Deanne Shields Marley, to come forward and light the chalice. Oh, also please note your insert in the order of service that lists upcoming events and other activities.
Lighting the chalice, these chalice lights words were composed by Reverend Deanna Vanderveer. We light this chalice, symbol of our faith alive in this world, naming our vision of collective liberation and daring to remember each other and to beloved community. Please join me in speaking the words of our affirmation of covenant printed in your order of service. Saying, love is the doctrine of this church, the quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve humankind in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other.
Last week I said, collectively, Americans have always stretched ourselves through democratic processes to hold a vision of love that fails no one. We have striven generation after generation toward collective liberation. It is quite understandable if you were thinking, now hold on, Reverend Paul. It seems more like systemic oppression of all of our non-white, non-heterosexual, non-cisgender, non-Anglophone, differently abled, and economically challenged neighbors is the most consistent theme in our history. Where has that vision of love that fails no one been? Fair enough. Democratic processes involve difference and debate. For everyone who reached toward a vision of more love, more inclusion, more equity, and therefore more justice, there were some who didn't want to stretch. Famously, when a young William F. Buckley Jr. founded National Review magazine in 1955, he declared that its editorial policy would be to stand athwart history, yelling, "Stop!" In its obituary for him, that magazine insisted that his point was to challenge the idea that history pointed left. But in putting it that way, I think he confessed it. Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor seems to agree. This past week in the gay wedding website case, she dissented, saying, "Today is a sad day in American constitutional law and in the lives of LGBT people. The Supreme Court of the United States declares that a particular kind of business, though open to the public, has a constitutional right to refuse to serve members of a protected class. The court does so for the first time in its history." We did not get to this state of affairs without a conservative movement in the 1970s that was newly awake to the need to organize, to mobilize, in order to preserve structures of oppression. They did it in the name of freedom, but they have an odd idea of what freedom is. As the Hoover Institution's Paul Kengor reports, during the 1970s, Ronald Reagan had often bemoaned the lack of freedom in the world, turning in his speeches to data from Freedom House, marking the number of free and unfree nations. As president, he dedicated himself to improving those numbers. In 1980, there were 56 democracies in the world. 13 years after he'd entered the Oval Office, the number of free nations had doubled. In 1994, 60% of the world's nations were democracies. Yet there was one part of the world immune to this wave of freedom: the Middle East. The least democratic region on the planet, and perhaps not coincidentally, the most violent. In the academic field of international relations, one of the few practical debates of the 1990s was the democratic peace thesis. The argument postulates that democracies, generally speaking, and depending on their level of maturity and stability, do not fight one another and are a safer bet to be peaceful. Thus, to the extent that the hostile Middle East becomes more democratic, it is likely to become more peaceful. Kengor continues describing how George W. Bush used Reagan's arguments as rationale for his own policies. And it's true that Bush drew on Reagan's rhetoric, but he was not as skilled in using it. There was one moment I remember vividly when, in defense of his policies towards Afghanistan and Iraq, he said something quite revealing. I don't mean his off-the-cuff remark, "We have an empire now," which was also revealing. I mean the time when he said in a speech, "Hate cannot be overcome by hate. Hate can only be overcome by freedom." That one sentence sums up what's odd about the conservative movement's notions about freedom. And George W. Bush, who I'm pretty sure went to Sunday school, should have known better. There he would have learned a different lesson. In one of his most famous sermons, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave that lesson. He said, "Returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding a deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." In our current political divide, the left says love wins, and the right says freedom wins. Where each goes off the rails is, of course, at the fringes. And in Congress, the fringe of the right now calls itself the Freedom Caucus. I find that if you take just about any speech by a member of that group and substitute for the word freedom each time it occurs the word power, it is immensely clarifying. Suddenly, the argument coheres. Their notion of freedom is the free exercise of power, privilege, and advantage in every aspect of life: political, economic, social, and especially individual, heedless of the costs to their neighbors or any other life on the planet. That's not traditional conservatism. That's something else. The problem with the notion that freedom overcomes hate is the same as with the notion that a free market produces a fair economy. Freedom just means you can choose, and that means you can still choose to hate. So how exactly does freedom overcome hate? All of that, though, is just the surface of things. Any thoughtful conservative would not only concede these points, but even anticipate and make them for me. The left's lust for change and the right's resistance to it are alternately energized by a collective sense of being out of balance. What's at the root of that pattern? Just as the quality of our love shapes the results of our freedom, so the quality of our social and economic relationships shape the performance of our democratic institutions. I turn now to briefly sketch some key but often overlooked historical sources of these patterns in our democracy and political economy. Democracies arose first among the privileged. In ancient Athens, democracy among citizens of the polis rested on slavery. That fact was cited to defend slavery in our country. In ancient Rome, the republic was controlled by a senate made up of property owners. The famous emblem of the Roman Republic, SPQR, a Latin abbreviation for the Senate and the people of Rome, acknowledged the divide between Rome's privileged and unprivileged, the Senate and the people. The Romans tried an institutional remedy to give the people more representation, the office of tribune. The tribunes were representatives in the sense of being advocates for the people and were granted power to veto the Senate's legislation. But in the violent culture of Rome, this reform only inspired greater contention and brutal bullying. Ultimately, the Republic was captured by an authoritarian faction and became the empire. In 16th century Poland, as in the Roman Republic, an elite ruling class democratically elected the king. But each member of that elite ran their own territory as they saw fit. And the people who lived on their lands, they understood in a feudal way as belonging to the land, and so were likewise subject to both their maintenance and to their use. A similar system prevailed in the polity of the Holy Roman Empire, as the medieval confederation of German states was known. When in that same century the Dutch asserted their independence as a republic, they stayed united by a compromise that established a prince of the republic. As a diplomat there during the American Revolution, John Adams described their system as the most inscrutable he ever saw. During deliberations about the American Constitution, he became an advocate of what he called the monarchical principle in government. Very odd thing to be for in this country during the American Revolution. What he meant was a locus of authority that could cut through the fog of political deliberations. Because he named it, though, as the monarchical principle, most could not hear what he meant. The bicameral Congress described in our Constitution is meant as an improvement on the Roman tribune system, giving the people's house an equal weight with a Senate then expected to be composed of elites. The voting public was similarly conceived as men of property. The preeminence of elite male landowners is among the strongest threads in the history of democracy and representative government. This has to do with how agrarian economies developed. A representative agrarian social order was encoded in British political institutions and their common law, which we inherit. The basic unit of economic production in an agrarian economy was the landed household. Land was the source of raw materials, seeds, soil, forage, and minerals, which a landed household exploited first for its own survival, producing food and tools and shelter and comforting amenities. And then, as its holdings allowed, it produced goods for trade or offered labor for hire. Such a household was conceived as having a head or master, whose dependents served the household under his direction. Like a feudal lord, he ran his household as he saw fit. As master, the state held him responsible for it. That's why, at the time of our country's birth, voters were conceived of as property-owning men. It comes from that context. To this day, if you want to get married and you don't want a church wedding, you can go before a justice of the peace. Why is that? In England, a justice of the peace was an official responsible for political jurisdictions. A new marriage meant a new household, the fundamental political jurisdiction. And once upon a time, also the fundamental productive unit of the British economy. So marriages fell within that official's area of responsibility. In a related development, today we call the study of the economy economics. But to begin with, it was called the political economy. The body politic and the body economic were at first understood to be inextricably intertwined. In an agrarian economy, skilled labor is highly valued. It's the only way to get things done in the absence of machines. Several norms flowed from this. One was the view that marriage was the sanctioned means of producing new supplies of labor. Accompanying that view was a bias towards heteronormative sexuality. Also, the master's wife and children and hired hands were understood both as his family and as his servants. When a household developed some form of craft production for trade, the master craftsman would take on apprentices, also understood to be servants in the household. To be an apprentice was like being adopted. All were valued, skilled laborers of some kind or other. And as members of the household and the family, were provided for and trained in the family's businesses. It was normal for the workplace to be highly relational because household and family were so intricately intertwined. The household labor force was cultivated for its best productivity, and each member was cared for within the family's material means and functional capacity to care. When it came to trade, hospitality stood out as an important value. The expectation of hospitality afforded access to a household's resources and products and the possibility of learning new skills. These agrarian values are emphasized in the Bible, but they do not come from there. Rather, the Bible reflects its original agrarian context. The privilege granted to the Bible as a culturally authoritative text encouraged the English to incorporate agrarian values into their common law and institutions. Agrarian life, then, dating back to the Bible, lasted a good long season. The advent of industrial capitalism radically altered the balance of our political economy with attendant implications for our values and ways of life. John Locke, who invested in agrarian industry, he owned stock in Caribbean sugar plantations. He played a major role in reshaping how we think about property and labor. Trying to explain how the product of a hired laborer could be owned by the capitalist, he started from an agrarian view of property. He said that when a person mixes his labor with a natural resource to create something new, for example, cultivating land or transforming one of its natural products by craft and skill, that resource, thus transformed, becomes proper to him. That is, it becomes his property because he's mixed himself into it with his labor. Okay? Locke, of course, cast the laborer as male in keeping with the usage of his day. When one sells one's labor in service to another, he said, the labor sold becomes separable. Your labor under contract belongs to your employer, not to you. Therefore, what you produce is not proper to you, but to your employer. And just like that, labor could be seen as a commodity rather than as the investment, the equity, the capital that it is. Every struggle of the labor movement can be traced to this shift in regard for labor. Industrialization also eroded the foundations of the old agrarian bias of heteronormativity. When the basic unit of economic production was no longer the household and family, family values were liberated from economic concerns. No longer need a family operate like a workshop. Instead, it could operate like a bank. In place of tools, property, and equipment for farming and manufacturing, a family might now have merely financial assets, deriving purely from hiring out labor, not from producing food or forage or craft goods. The demand for productive labor within the household then was much diminished. It need only achieve household maintenance, not necessarily household profitability. Since a smaller family is more financially sustainable, children became a costly treasure instead of a source of household productivity and wealth. This was seen as a humanitarian gain for children, and I think it was. But it also raised other questions. Why should one not choose to be single? Why should one not choose to be childless? Why should one not choose to be queer? And why own real estate? Why should a household have such trappings when it no longer serves the economic functions that made them necessary? The house with the picket fence is derived from the farm and the workshop, right? Freed of the burdens of production in an agrarian economy, family values look different. Marriage looks different. To paraphrase Anita Bryant, it's not just for heterosexuals anymore. Families look different. They are much more mobile, and more often they are chosen. Individual fulfillment looks different, especially since the pandemic. It's much less about sacrifice for material success and much more about a calling. And so the role of churches in supporting families looks different. It's not about enforcing the old agrarian norms anymore, but about supporting families as safe harbors of love and nurture in an economy that has all but left such responsibilities behind. There was quite a moving moment in the 2016 presidential campaign when one of Hillary Clinton's events was interrupted by Black Lives Matter demonstrators. Unlike her opponent, who might have mocked them and urged the crowd on to violence against them, Clinton engaged them in conversation. One moment was caught on both camera and microphone. One of the demonstrators argued with anguished passion for the need to change hearts to end racism. Clinton replied, "I don't believe you change hearts. I believe you change laws." In fact, both are needed. Because Clinton is right that freedom doesn't produce justice. And the eloquent young woman she spoke with was also right. In a free and democratic society, everything depends upon how we choose to regard and treat each other. Hearts need to change, and laws need to help them. Because an ethic of risk demands our willingness to show up as we are and be willing to be changed. Democracy is not simply voting. It's a faith and a philosophy and a way of life. It's organizing and commitment to values and truth, and a willingness to learn and respect another perspective, and to care about your neighbors and the planet. Americans have always tried to do these things as best we could. Collectively, we have stretched ourselves again and again to hold a vision of love that fails no one. We have striven generation after generation toward collective liberation. So much is possible. We are called by our faith, whether our politics lean left or right, to resist all that denies the dignity and worth of our neighbors and our planet. The risk, the loss, the messiness, the grief of this time are the path to love and justice for all. Collective liberation is for all of us or none of us. So, as my colleague said, let us commit and recommit to the vision of a free and beloved community with love that fails no one. So may it be. Amen. Now I invite Deanne to come back up and extinguish the chalice while we say the words of closing, which are in your order of service. Go out into the world in peace, have courage, hold on to what is good, return to no one evil for evil, strengthen the faint-hearted, support the weak, help the suffering, honor all beings. And may we stretch again and again toward each other and toward the vision of love that fails no one.